This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Kameelah Martin, who teaches in the Department of African American Studies at the College of Charleston. She has written extensively on African American literature and diasporic cultural studies, and is the author of Conjuring Moments in African American Literature, Women's Spirit Work and Other Such Hoodoo from 2012, Envisioning Black Feminist Voodoo Aesthetics, African Spirituality in American Cinema from 2016, and is the co-editor of The Lemonade Reader from 2019. In this conversation, we discuss the place of literary studies in the field of Black studies, the relationship between folk cultural production and everyday Black life, and the reach of Black study inside and outside the academy. Hello, Kameelah. How are you today?
Hi, John. I'm doing well.
Welcome to Black Studies Podcast. I really am so happy you made time to talk with me today and be a part of this series. I think that the kind of work you're doing is super interesting, and the fact that people will get to hear about your work, hear about your thoughts on the field of Black studies is really going to be a fantastic part of the series. So I appreciate your time, but I also appreciate your willingness to share your thinking and your vision of the field and your vision of your own work and the study of literature and culture, all of these things with us today. So welcome, and also thank you.
Well, thank you. I am thrilled to be here.
Let me start, we'll get into the field of Black studies, how you imagine the field and how your work sort of sits in relation to that. But I wanted to start with a question that's maybe, more personal, more direct about you and your own journey, and ask you to narrate a little bit for us how you came to the study of Black life, sort of what drew you to that study, what drew you to Black studies, and also for me, always a question, what sustains your relationship to it? It's a lot of work, it's a lot of effort, it can be emotionally exhilarating and exhausting, so something sustains us. So what drew you to this work? What keeps you here?
Absolutely. So there are two things that really kind of mark my entrance into Black studies. I started undergrad as a psychology major, believe it or not, and I thought I wanted to work with autistic children. I had a whole plan. And I got into my intro to psychology course, and the instructor is talking about all these, hidden meanings behind water and using Freud. And I found myself just completely disengaged because I kept thinking, but what do you mean people think this? Water has a particular sexual symbolism in dreams. And I was like, Black people don't think that. I don't think that. And I could not engage with the material that, she was, giving to us. And I just was like, I can't do this, and now I can kind of reflect and think back to, understand that there was no cultural sensitivity. There was no even an acknowledgement of perspectives beyond white Eurocentric ideologies. And that was fine for some people, but there was just this grumbling in my soul. I remember sitting in the seat. I was like, I cannot do this for the rest of my life. I just think she's wrong, right? What she's giving us is just not the complete picture, right, of humanity. And if this is what I'm going to have to do as a career and think about these things, then I need to do something else. So that was the first experience. So I decided, okay, well, I'm really good at I love reading, I love writing. I'm really good at this. Let me try, to be an English major, journalism major, double major. And so I was in an intro to African American literature course taught by Professor David Dudley. And I went into the bookstore to get the book, right? And it was one of those Norton anthologies that has like 3,000 very thin pages. And I was completely blown away. I was a sophomore, and I never knew until that moment that there was an entire history, entire tradition that could fill 3,000 pages of Black people's writing. And I just decided in that moment, okay, this is it. for the rest of my life, I'm going to study. I am going to master this literary tradition. This is what I'm doing with my life. I had also come to really enjoy the small class sizes, the discussion-based style that I was engaging with my professors. And so I decided maybe this is something that I can do. I can be a professor. But if I'm going to be a professor, I'm going to spend my life, right, studying the Black literary tradition. And so that was very clear to me. So yes, I was an English major, but we also had an Africana Studies minor. And so I married the two because I knew from that moment that was what I was going to do with my life. That was going to be my life's work. And so that it was kind of a natural progression. Now, in terms of what sustains me, I think it's the same thing that drew me. It is the titillation of, learning about Black history, Black culture, Black expression, because it's a never-ending continuum, right? There are all these different periods to study, but it's also evolving, right? I have a stack of books of more recent published novels that I need to get through, but it's like I am just hungry for it, right? And so that's a little bit about how I got into the study, or Black studies rather. Yeah.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I have to say there's almost like a subgroup in this, and I include myself in this podcast, of people who came to college as psychology majors and instantly decided they wanted to, why was I doing that? It's just funny to hear this come up. I think psychology and economics, that's like 90% of incoming classes.
Right.
So it was interesting to hear you talk about, I think we all have our stories about, why did we switch? But also, Ashley and I are going to shift bits of the podcast in the future to more topics, questions of pedagogy, critical theory, in Black studies. And this is, I think, the third podcast that mentioned as formative the encounter with or experience with the Norton. Because as you say, there's something physical, I sort of laughed when you said 3,000 really thin pages. It's just that the enormity of it. And I give it to students regularly. For some reason, I have a bunch of copies. This is part of the publisher sending it to you to sign it in classes. But I love giving it to students because you can see both, wow, that's a lot to read. Mm-hmm. But you can see the exhilaration of people who love to read. But really to the meaning of what you were saying, this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages of tradition. And that's just getting started.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I always give it and say, this is a starting point. And you see wow, that's a starting point has we all fear when we have a huge stack that we need to do, but also that thrill, as you say. I love that you're talking about exhilaration and pleasure as part of drawing in, but also sustaining.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It just was, I was appalled, however, that I was 19 years old and had no idea that there was this much larger tradition. So I was like, where have I been? And so it was both a challenge to myself, but also a very clear pathway for what I could do with my career.
And that surprise that you have, not to make everything about our contemporary moment, but the sort of hostility around the AP African American Studies has been interesting to me because part of it is just generalized anti-Blackness. We don't want people talking about race and racism, that sort of thing. But I think also part of it is with these decisions, to move against it, right? The decision to make it is made by people who understand, but the move against it are people who never had that 19-year-old experience. And
absolutely.
They change our world through ignorance, water is wet, but this is really terrible, as a moment, but also I love that the exhilaration of that discovery. Yeah. And maybe this is, some natural segue into this second question I have for you, which is really just to get you to talk a little bit about your imagination of the field of Black studies. It has, a complicated origin that I think has a really interesting tension built into it and is part of the quote unquote debates in Black studies about its nature of the field. Right. One is the real political demand in the late 1960s and early 1970s around Black liberation struggle to reconfigure the relationship between intellectual life and political activism, campuses and communities that has that imperative of political, intervention.
Mhm.
But alongside that was also, of course, the critique of disciplines, that they hadn't studied Black life in any kind of significant way, and certainly not on its own terms, but now we were going to do that in Black studies.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that sense of commitment to an intellectual tradition is very different than a commitment to an activist politics in
Yes.
its moment. But there's
Mhm.
also a relationship between those.
There is, absolutely.
And we're also 54 years, 55 years after this moment. And so I'm interested to hear you reflect on how you imagine the field sort of in the context of this origin story that has such a tension built into it.
Yeah, I think I acknowledge the tension, but I also kind of push back and I'm like, but why does there have to be a tension? Why does Black studies have to be one or the other? Because for me, and even thinking about the change of the discipline from the mid-90s to the present, I think about, and what I think is really beautiful about Black studies is that it has evolved from, its origins. It hasn't left it behind, but it has grown and expanded into this bigger thing that I think still pays homage to the need for Black liberation movements and theology and theories, while also feeding what I imagine as kind of two other branches, if you will, of the discipline, right? So there's the activist and community side of it, right? Which we know is still very necessary. But what resonates with me and where I kind of see myself fitting into this history is the desire of students, right, to have this new body of knowledge, to be educated about Black history, Black life, Black origins, as a sustained discipline, right? So there's that, right? I was a very hungry undergrad. I wanted all of it. I wanted to learn all of it, right? And so that really resonates. And I think there's still a space for that, right? That still exists. But then I think about what Black studies has produced and how it has an impact on how Black people are treated in the world, in the United States, right? I think about all of the scholarship that has been produced. I think about all of the data. I think about all of the racial disparities reports. If we didn't have Black studies, right, we wouldn't have scholars who would produce that work without bias, without, a white supremacist or anti-Black lens, right? And we wouldn't be able to feed that into, or rather arm our politicians, our policymakers, our administrators to impact the way that policy is informed in our country. And so I think those things don't have to be in tension. We can arm our politicians with the data and the information and the case studies, right, to fuel their work, right? At the same time that we're also training and teaching our community activists and leading that fight as well, and also creating an academic space for the students who don't really know what they want to do, but they know that they want to learn about who they are, their culture, their impact, or perhaps another person's culture, right? So that they can be more informed and be better citizens. And so I think about it in those three ways, and I think it's a beautiful thing. And I think we would be much worse off as a society, particularly in the way that we engage with Black people. I mean, we still have a long way to go, right? Things aren't perfect. But can you imagine if we didn't have the data, if we didn't have the case studies, the research to support some of the policy decisions that are being made or at least being advocated for? We'd be much worse without that. And so I think, more holistically about Black studies. And I love that it has evolved into this much wider and I think more impactful discipline for society.
And, as you yourself gave, personal testimony, right? The discovery of an intellectual tradition is transformative too.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
And I do think it's an interesting question to ask in 2024 as well. And I've thought a lot about, asking this question 5-10 years ago and how it might resonate a little differently because and maybe, I'm in a small number of people, but I think I'm probably in a large number of people, maybe had underestimated how dangerous the idea of ideas is. And I don't think anyone is saying that in 2024.
Correct.
Because people are not intervening to change curricula around community collaborations. They're doing it around the teaching of history and literature. Always for me, inexplicably targeting Toni Morrison, right? It's explicable, but also kind of like these novels are really hard to read.
Right,
But
absolutely.
also maybe that's part of the point, right? We cannot reveal sophistication and depth. And so the politics, the multiple resonances of politics that you were just talking about, I think is such an interesting way to revisit this very question. Let me ask you about your work. You're invested in literary and visual materials, historical study, folk cultural studies.
Yes.
And I'm really interested in how you think about your own work and the sort of mixture of these interests and methods, how you think about your own work in relation to the past of Black studies, right? How does it sort of, how do you think it fits into aspects of the tradition? But also, what new horizons do you think your work is opening up?
Yeah, that's a rich question. And when I think about my work and I think about why I chose this particular pathway, again, for me, I think of myself and my work as answering to that student need, hunger for knowledge, right? So I think it fits into Black studies in that way. And I get it. Other scholars will say that their work does other things and it fits in other ways, and that's fine. But for me, I am very comfortable and I was awakened to the possibilities of Black studies through the student-professor experience. And so in my own way, I am very much invested in continuing that for the next generation or generations of students. And so I do certainly think of myself as, being both invested and responsible for continuing that creation of knowledge and proliferation of knowledge in the classroom. I think that my work, particularly coming, and I know we'll get to this, when I was in a traditional English department, my work, my teaching, my research, it really offered a diverse perspective on the layered meanings of Black cultural production, right? It moved away from just, these are the Black American authors that you should be familiar with, to really deconstructing, like, what is this literary tradition built on? Where are its antecedents? What are the layered and subtextual meanings behind using a certain phrase or vernacular sophistication, rhetorical traditions, right? And so, even within the English department, we can read Toni Morrison without those things, right? But bringing in the cultural aspect makes it that much richer. It makes us understand that Toni Morrison, yes, she's an American master, but she is also being very intentional about, the tradition from which she's pulling, which she's building her stories, which she's sharing her narratives, the voices and the experiences of her characters. And I think if we read her without that context, then we miss half of the richness of her work. So I think my work contributes in that way. And I think, lately I've been thinking about the way that my work emphasizes what I like to call the inherent international scope of the discipline. I don't think we talk about that enough. Black studies, while we can talk about its history and origin here in the U.S., I think we also have to remember that before there was a Black studies program and discipline, right? We had Pan-Africanism. We had, these other countries, particularly thinking about the African independence movement, we really had this transnational conversation about what was happening in African descended communities. And my work, particularly when I think about and I talk about the literature, the culture, I'm connecting West Africa to the Caribbean, to North America, to Brazil. And I think that's important. I know for myself as a student, coming up, my curriculum was very American-based. I didn't begin to think about and understand the diasporic connections of the discipline until I got into graduate school and I was looking at African spirituality, right? You can't talk about African spirituality without going back to the continent and understanding where it came from. And so when I think about the second part of your question, New Horizons, that's one of the things that I'm very, very proud of, is also seeing the globalization of the discipline, which is inherent, but I think sometimes we forget to talk about it in that way. And so that's kind of where right now I really want my students to think beyond the U.S. borders, the U.S. South, and what's happening here, and connect it to other global Black communities, right? Because there are connections, there are comparisons to be made. There are certainly differences, right? But to put those things in conversation and understand what their relationship is, I think is important for students to know. And so I attempt to do that through my work.
Yeah, and I think about, when you were talking about the sort of what are the, I forget what you called it. It's like the sources of these literary figures.
Yes,
I mean,
yes. Mm-hmm.
I think a lot about and talk a lot in my classes about Ellison, who,
Mm-hmm.
Obviously has these influences, whether it's, Joyce or Dostoevsky or obviously Hughes and Wright. But when he talks about the origins of Invisible Man, he is like, well, I came to an understanding of language getting my hair cut. And I tried to make that alive in the novel. And whether
Absolutely.
It's successful or not kind of turns on that. I mean, he himself says it, but how often we think in academic context about that. I think that's both work that's already there, as you were saying about internationalism, it's already there. But what does it mean to see the thing that's right in front of us?
Right.
Because as you were saying, so many of these texts, I think it's one of the great challenges of Gilroy's The Black Atlantic that I know there are lots of criticisms of the book, and any good book should have a lot of criticisms. But he was like, buried inside Du Bois, actually on the surface, but buried in terms of readership is his internationalism. Richard Wright in Paris, Baldwin in Turkey.
Yes, absolutely.
And figuring out ways to see what's directly in front of us is pushes new horizons. But I always say to students when I'm trying to help them come up with new topics, especially grad students, I'm like, just look at what's in front of you, because you probably don't have to go find it in a dusty corner.
Absolutely.
And that's really exciting. So I love the way you were talking about it. I'm really repeating what you said, but I really love that discovery of what was right there. Yeah, but it also changes the way we think.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I always like to point my students to the example of Marcus Mosiah Garvey, right? We think about him, he's often taught in the context of the Harlem Renaissance, but I'm like, people, let's understand that before he came to Harlem, he was in Panama, he was in Jamaica, he was doing all of these things. And then moving forward to 1957 and thinking about Kwame Nkrumah, right? And understanding that the Black Star on the Ghanaian national flag is a direct contribution of Marcus Garvey's thinking, right? And then we add the civil rights movement of the U.S. influencing the West African independence movement, and we have a totally different conversation. And so, again, it is right in front of us, but I think sometimes and I'll speak for my campus, right? I think sometimes we fail to make those connections for our students so they can understand that African American studies, Black studies is a global interdisciplinary field.
Yeah. It's funny, not to go too much into examples, but I teach a class called Cinema of the Black Atlantic, and so we do some African, Caribbean, and U.S. cinema. And I've tended in the past, just two places I've taught over the last 20 something years, have had really international student groups, right? Predominantly African American, but also African or African immigrant children, or West Indian children or West Indian immigrants, and their discovery of the fact that things that are right in front of them, that the city-country relationship is constitutive of political imaginations and cultural imaginations, might actually travel. Trying to push that into the center. And what's interesting to me is, and I think it gets to, I'll use your word again, their experience of that is exhilarating. Not shame, not embarrassment, but intrigue and like, I need to learn more. Let's stay after class. Let me talk with a group of people about it, right? I mean, this is the thrill of Black Studies.
Absolutely. Nothing better.
And I'm totally curious if how students react to the Black Star being on the flag.
It's definitely a kind of mind-blowing experience for them.
Yeah,
because they didn't think about it, right? And for what really gets me is when I have students who are football fans, and then they think, if they're familiar enough with the Ghanaian national team, which are the Ghanaian Black Stars, it completely blows their mind to think that these two seemingly different worlds are very much connected theoretically and in terms of the scholarship and the political movement. It's actually pretty great to see it. I love to see it.
I think people who teach in Black Studies or teach Black materials who listen to this podcast will probably all be bringing that to the classroom, because I'm very curious to see. I'm going to find a way to have a moment and say, "Do you all ever notice this or know this?" And see what happens, because it's one of those not small, but it's a easy example.
Yes.
To identify. That then opens up all of the complexities.
Absolutely.
But also this fact that people communicated before Twitter, a promise.
Yes, exactly.
Well, let me ask a question about another question about your intellectual journey. You've described it, right, of as a graduate student doing both undergraduate and graduate student doing both Black Studies and literary studies, and then your PhD was in English.
Correct.
And so I'm interested in how that movement in your education, but also as you said in your appointments, having been in an English department, now being in an AFAM department, how that movement between disciplinary training, disciplinary teaching, and the sort of standards and habits that come from that, and then the area studies, the Black Studies, which is very different, both in terms of your training and in terms of your intellectual and classroom practices. How's that movement between discipline and area studies animated and affected how you think and write, but also how you construct a classroom, how you teach?
Yeah, choosing the PhD program was agonizing, because I knew what my commitment was to. It was to Black Studies. But at the time, there were only literally a handful of doctoral programs in Black Studies or African American Studies. And I actually played this back in my mind, like, oh my gosh, like, if I could do it all again now, like the options that students have, right? They don't have to go through this, struggle to decide where their alliance lies. And I certainly felt that. On the one hand, I had advisors saying, Black Studies, you'll get a job. It'll be fine. You can do what you want. And on the other side, I had other advisors, mentors saying, you need a traditional degree in a traditional discipline if you really want to get a job, if you want to be taken seriously, right? And so we were still very much having those conversations. And so for me, it really came down to, I knew that I wanted to study Black literature, right, and folklore. And when I started to look at the curriculum and the programs that existed, I didn't see the number of courses and the type of emphasis. I couldn't build the emphasis I wanted in those programs because they were so heavily geared towards the social sciences. The humanities, yes, but I couldn't get the type of literary training that I thought I wanted and needed. And of course, the folklore piece of that as well in those programs. And so reluctantly, I decided that I guess I am going to get a degree in English, right? Because that was what I wanted. I wanted the literary training. But that was a hard decision. It was definitely a hard decision. I don't regret it. I still had to take a bunch of courses on dead white men, and they have no use to me because I don't teach that stuff. But I feel like I really did come out of it with this robust expertise in African American literature. And I also found a program where they had an African American folklorist on staff. And so I was able to really build the type of coursework and independent study and, of course, dissertation and all of those things that really spoke to what my interest was. Because I knew kind of coming out of coming out of undergrad, that I wanted to talk about African spirituality. And so I needed a program that would help me do that. So I don't regret it, but I remember the angst I felt. I felt like I was betraying Black studies, right? Professionally, let's see. So I think early on, there were certainly in the traditional English department, I definitely struggled with having my work and my expertise validated. Again, people were like, oh, she can teach Richard Wright and Toni Morrison, but we really want her to teach, Nathaniel Hawthorne and all these American literature surveys, right? And there was really no space to really grow that program or that curriculum around my expertise. That there was just no interest in it, right? Oh, we're going to offer maybe one or two courses in African American literature. Maybe we'll let you design a course that specialized on, say, Toni Morrison, but that was really it. And so I struggled there for a while. Then I went to an HBCU and had a very different experience where the entire curriculum was built around the literatures of the African diaspora. They had Caribbean literature, they had African literature, they had creative nonfiction, and I could just explore and teach without having to argue why my particular reading list or the approach that I was taking was necessary and useful and valuable to English majors. And so that was a very different experience. And I love that experience. It really helped me to kind of sharpen my chops, right? Like to be able to teach all of these different courses in the expertise that I had. I felt like before I had been stifled. I couldn't even really explore and make use of the expertise that I had. And then I went to that HBCU, and it was just like, oh, we're gonna do all of the things. And it was just, again, exhilarating. It was the sort of it validated why I chose the area that I chose, and it was wonderful. But the goal was always to be in African American studies and to be able to do that sort of work in an African American studies program or department. Because, again, thinking back to my own experience, I thought about students who wanted the information, right? And that they would choose these courses because they wanted to, right? That they would be there, they would show up, and they would be engaged because they were invested the way that I was. And I also thought about, if I'm going to be in the academy, then I want to be around like-minded people, right? Peers and colleagues who, again, I don't have to explain to them the value of the work that I do, particularly around my scholarship. And so I finally got here. Took a while, but I got here, and there's certainly a level of freedom that I have that I just have not felt in any other space, in terms of developing new coursework, in terms of even some of the ideas around programming that we're able to offer. In fact, just last week, it's all mixed together. We invited
September weeks blend.
Right.
It's one big week.
Right. The hip hop artist Bun B came to campus and we had a lecture with Bun B, and it was the blackest thing ever. Right. And so to be able to be in a space where that sort of work can happen and it's valued and people show up and they're engaged, there's just nothing like it. There's nothing like it. So, I will, and it's interesting because I actually hardly teach literature courses anymore. Like, I've definitely leaned into the interdisciplinarity of my work. Yes, we do reading, and yes, we write. But like a straight up and down literature course, unless it is African American literature, I have the freedom to really spread my wings and really pull on the expertise that I've developed over the years. And it's a great feeling, and students love it. They desire it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this moving from discipline to area study and the way it opens up the kinds of things, as you were saying, the kinds of everything from programming to the reception of your work and ideas, yes, to what's expected in a classroom. I think these are really really profound changes. No, thank you for that response. That was really interesting, and it's a really interesting journey. It was kind of almost methodical. It was like I went through a phase of a lot of alienation. I was in English, but less alienated. And I came home to Black Studies.
Yes, I think of it as exactly that. It was a homecoming for sure. It was a homecoming.
That's fantastic. Not a lot of people get to have that last part. So
absolutely.
So let me ask you a speculative question, sort of backwards looking, about the field of Black Studies. When you think about over the 5+ decades at this point of Black Studies, what do you think the field has done well? And what do you think it has not done particularly well?
Yeah. So I think I'm going to start with what I think it hasn't done particularly well. And I will just preface this response by saying that this is definitely a generalization. I know that there are programs and scholars who do this work, but I think overall, the reception and the understanding of what Black Studies is, I think lacks in this particular area. And for me, it really is putting Africa at the center, right? Mm-hmm. Drawing connections to all of the wonderful and robust research and teaching that happens within the context of the United States and even the Caribbean, right? And making the connection to African studies or the continent of Africa, and really engaging with what's happening there as a way of helping our students understand that we talk about Africa as the motherland, right? But when it comes to the discipline, I feel like, and again, I'm aging myself, and I understand that I wasn't around for the first, back in the 60s and 70s when all of these programs were starting to get their legs. But I remember as an undergrad really thinking about and learning about the Afrocentric scholar, right? And that Africa was very much a part of your disciplinary training. And I think now about conversations that I've had around with colleagues, there seems to be a tension between Black studies, some Black studies programs, and African studies. And I feel like that's just absolutely ridiculous, right? But I also understand that the history of African studies is very different from the history and origins of Black studies. But I still feel like in terms of the content, the knowledge, the engagement, right? We talk about, community activism, being on the ground, Black liberation. We should be having deeper and more nuanced conversations and discussions and engagement with the African continent and even our colleagues in African studies. So I think that's something that I kind of see us moving away from in some departments, in some areas. But I feel like we should not allow that to happen. Now, what I think we do particularly well goes back to my earlier point about how robust the scholarship is. I had a chance, or I guess I was challenged by our advising unit. They didn't know how to advise students who were interested in African American studies. What sort of jobs can you get? What sort of work can be done? And, I challenged them. I was like, give me a discipline, give me a job, name it. I will point you to either scholarship, research, job opportunities, or talk you through how African American studies can be incorporated into that particular career path, right?
And I love that, turning the question around. I love that. Sorry, I'm going to use that.
Absolutely, because I'm like, listen, you have to be able to talk to these students because, and I'm sure you've probably heard this, what can you do with a degree in African American studies? And I'm like, anything, right? Even with our STEM students, right? We point them to medical apartheid, algorithms of oppression, right? There is still space in STEM to discuss race, social justice, cultural competencies, right, around people who are of African descent and how we're left out of those conversations and how they need to be put back in, right? So I think what we have done incredibly well is really spread our wings to touch as many disciplines as possible in terms of bringing the Black perspective, right, into those spaces, and not just race and oppression, right, but really nuanced ways of talking about the Black experience, whether it's international or domestic. But I mean, I love seeing the titles that are coming out. And I also remember being an undergrad and, there was a very small section in the library that covered African American studies, right? Maybe a shelf or two, right? But now, I mean, the sky is the limit. I think we really have challenged the academy to pay closer attention and to value the work that can be produced when you're using a Black studies lens or you're focused on African descended populations. I think we have just completely blown the lid off of our own expectations in terms of the scholarship that has been produced. And for me, I am just so really proud of it. And again, I talk about it not just in terms of the scholarship and research interests that my students might find, but also then translating that into, right, career readiness, right? Because that's what students are interested in. You want to know what you can do with Black studies? Let's look at a couple of examples and figure out how and why you might major, double major, or minor in African American studies. I had one student who was a political science major, and she knew that she wanted to be a speechwriter. That was her career goal. And I was like, oh, you want to study speeches? Let's talk about the Black rhetorical tradition. Let's talk about the orature of Black writers and readers, right? And she took that, and I should try to go find her and see what she's doing now. But for her, that made perfect sense, right? But no one would have told her, like, if you want to be a speechwriter, you should probably study Frederick Douglass and Malcolm X and MLK and all of these other rhetoricians from the Black vernacular tradition, right? And so I'm just extremely proud to be part of the generation that have produced all of this new scholarship and thought of new innovative ways to incorporate Black studies into the academy.
I mean, I first, as I already said, I love your reversal of that question. It's funny because I always tell people, like, we shouldn't just accept the premises of questions that are trying to basically put us on the defensive. Ask them, like, why that question or what's behind that question. I love this reversal of the question. And I often, like you said, like the shelf, right? It's both literal and metaphorical. The shelf of Black studies research, I say that often to students when they say, well, what can you do? Or what is Black studies? And I say, just browse my shelf. I have a million books. I'm not pointed and this is just audio, but thousands of books. And I'm like, just peruse. I mean, you'll find like people talking about democracy and voting. You'll find people talking about recovery of like musical traditions. I see people talking high theory, some people talking about medical, history of medicine or the future of medicine, all of these things. The way the bookshelf answers the question, I really, that's fantastic. I'm glad I asked and you responded. That was really great. Well, let me think then less about is a reverse time in terms of our imagination here, not so much about the past of Black studies, but about the future of Black studies. And this is a question that comes from me, and I think of this almost in a sort of Afrofuturist mode. Imagining what in the future would be the sign of the success of Black studies, right? To me, you can sort of think about this in relation to the origins of it around the question of the intellectual tradition. Is the success of Black studies in the future, however far off that is, to be signified by us having so transformed disciplines that you can no longer say you can't study Black life in its fullness in English, in history, in philosophy, in sociology, psychology, etc. And so in that way, part of the success of Black studies is to eventually dissolve itself, right? Because it has so transformed what we think of as the landscape of ideas and inquiry. Or is the success of Black studies to be that development, however nascent or however full it is in the present, but in the future, the development of a set of methodologies and critical framings that can't be absorbed and digested by disciplines, that we really become in that way like a discipline that has hopefully a fullness to it, but can't be absorbed into other things. What for you, thinking about the far off in the future of Black studies, would be its success sign?
Success. Well, I think about in the present moment, present political moment, cultural moment, the necessity of disciplines like Black studies and ethnic studies, precisely because those disciplines, those ideas have been under attack recently, right? So it's almost like we still have a lot of work to do, right?
Yeah, that's why I said it's almost a science fiction kind of imagination here.
Yeah. And so, I don't imagine that there will ever be a moment where Black studies won't exist. There won't be a need for it to exist because we've evolved so far that people are, being good citizens and race is no longer this contention, and we're not living in this caste system according to our racial and sexual orientations, right? So I think I may be being pessimistic, but I don't think that day is ever coming, or certainly not in my lifetime, right? So I think that there will always be a need for Black studies. But in terms of a sign of success, how does it exist? Does it go away? Can it stand alone? I think it's a both and for me. I think that there are. I think about the ways that Black studies research and teaching has really changed the topography of our conventional disciplines. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think it can coexist with history, with political science, with English, without necessarily being fully absorbed, right? But at the same time, I mean, it just depends how deep do you want to go. You can be a political scientist, right, and still have a need to develop and make use of your own methodologies and theories to articulate a very particular experience or perspective, right? And I'm thinking about, you mentioned Paul Gilroy. I think about Toni Morrison's Writing in the Dark, right? Or Cynthia Dillard's In Darkened Feminisms, right? These theoretical frameworks that complement, right, some of the more traditional disciplines or approaches to material or context, but also give a very specific language and cultural understanding to the way that we're applying them. And so I think the two can coexist, right? And particularly for my work, they are coexisting, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's also a sign of success, right? Is that we're able to move in and out of these spaces, make use of post-colonial theory and all of those things, but also pull from it and create something new that is more aligned to a particular demographic or a particular experience or a particular positionality. I don't think that denigrates the traditional discipline. I think it enhances it, right? And for me, that is a sign of success. But thinking way down the line, like when people stop asking, what can you do with Black Studies degrees? That is going to be a sign of success. When it is simply, just a given that a student who's majoring in African American Studies or Black Studies, that there are plenty of career options for them to apply that knowledge. When we stop asking that question, I think that will be a sign of success, because it would imply that we as a discipline are finally at a place where we aren't necessarily defending our right to exist in the academy, right? That we're no longer just, we're good for the window dressing and we want to make students feel more included on campus. So we're going to have this unit, right? We're going to call it a program. We're not going to give it departmental status, but it's a place where they can exist. But it's really not more than that, We still struggle with being taken seriously, I think, on some campuses. And yes. When they stop asking that question, then we'll know that we have succeeded, and then we can move on to other things that we want to do.
That also, no longer being asked that question, feels a little science fiction-y too, but definitely, hopefully, a closer horizon than the premise of my question.
Sure.
So let me ask you a last question, which is just really. In some ways, I think you've spoken to this in multiple ways, but just to ask it directly, what do you think is the question we should all be asking, or the thing that we should all be thinking about in the field of Black Studies?
What is our relationship, or what should and could our relationship to African studies and the African continent be in the future of Black Studies? Because I think there's an opportunity to re-envision it, to shape it into something more collaborative, more reciprocal. I'd like to see some of those questions asked, and that's top of mind because I've been grappling with some of that with my colleagues. African Studies doesn't necessarily want to collaborate with African American Studies. And because they think that they'll be overshadowed, right? Or that somehow their distinct discipline and perspective will be, dissolved into African American studies, and they want to stay separate. I understand that, but I'm also like, but is that more important than the work that could be done if we really challenged what we're doing as scholars and teachers? And so that's the question I would like us to continue to ask.
I love that question, and I hope that all of us do. I agree with you. I think this is absolutely so essential, but as you say, this is not, it has to be thought. When you use that word reciprocal, I was like, okay, that's a word that we start to unpack in a Black Studies context. It's going to actually have a lot of possibilities, because
Absolutely.
The idea, the threat of imperial sort of takeover is real. but also the field knows what it means to be taken over.
Right.
And so we do have resources for a different kind of ethics. So I love that. That's a fantastic challenge for all of us to think about and hopefully take on, because so many of us work in these departments, and it's a question to ask at our own front door. So
Absolutely.
I appreciate that. And I really appreciate your time. I know I said it at the beginning. I really love your work. I think it's super interesting and really exemplary of Black studies and what it can be. And so I had really high hopes and expectations for our conversations, like well beyond that. This has been so interesting. People are going to love listening to this and thinking about it. You've given us like so much to consider. And so thank you for your thoughtfulness. I really appreciate that.
No, thank you. It's a joy and an intellectual passion of mine. So I'm happy. I'm happy to even be asked the questions and have space to really expand on, some of these thoughts in a public forum. So thank you.
All right. Well, I look forward to future conversations, crossing paths, ideas in person, in words. But for now, have a great rest of your day.
All right. You do the same. Take care.
All right. You too. Bye-bye.